War Plan Red was one of a series of color-coded war plans drafted by the U.S. Army and Navy to be used in the late 1920s or early 1930s. War Plan Red estimated what it would cost for a war with the British Empire. At the time, the British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. The plan was drafted in 1927 following the Geneva Naval Conference and approved by the Secretary of War in May 1930. The plan was scrapped after the U.S. involvement in World War II. While the causes of the supposed war with the British Empire were unknown, you have to look at the U.S.-British relations in the 1900s. After World War I, Britain owed a tremendous amount of money to the U.S. due to the war. Britain, however, was waiting for the money from the Germans, which they would give to the U.S., but the U.S. were not willing to wait, adding fuel to the fire. Canada had Defense Scheme 1, a contingency plan to invade the U.S. in the west and center if war broke out. Its plan was to cut railroad and communication lines to slow down the American mobilization process, essentially to do whatever it takes to slow the Americans down so that the British Army can arrive in Canada. This plan was created by Brigadier General James Sutherland Brown and was revered as the best plan to protect Canada. America, after winning World War I, would use some of its funds to create 3 airfields disguised as civilian airfields. Additional planes, ships, and poisonous gas would be purchased. Training on large-scale operations would be conducted to prepare for the war. Unfortunately, this information would get leaked out, causing the British and Canada to be concerned for a war with the US. Britain would send an additional 50,000 troops to reinforce the 500,000 strong Canadian army. FDR would tell Britain and Canada they should not be worried about any war, but obviously this wasn't the case. In 1932, under the element of surprise, the U.S. begins invasion of Canada and declares war. Under the research conducted and the fact that this is a hypothetical war, this is my best interpretation of War Plan Red. The first move by the U.S. Army is to rapidly take troop divisions aboard naval transports to launch an invasion of Halifax, using artillery, poisonous gas, and sheer numbers of troops. The goal was to have the city, a major naval base for Britain, taken within 10 days of the war, cutting it off from troops to reinforce Canada. Ultimately, given the time and scale of this battle, it would have failed. Britain would still be able to retain its naval base in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, other American armies were prepared to launch 3 more invasions into Canada, through Michigan, the Midwest, and Oregon. Also, naval skirmishes to take the British colonies and the Caribbean would be conducted, cutting off its access from the Atlantic Ocean. Canada, now seeing this as a full-scale invasion, would activate Defense Scheme 1, effectively utilizing a scorched earth policy in the U.S., cutting railroad lines, communications, and bridges, and anything to slow down the American invasion, in hopes Canada would survive long enough that the British forces of 2 million could arrive to reinforce the Canadians. Canada would invade Seattle, Fargo, Minneapolis, and Albany, but would soon have to retreat and destroy everything due to the impending American invasion forces. American troop divisions would march along the border and cross it to take Vancouver, cutting off Britain's naval access into the Pacific, hurting her trade. Winnipeg to split Canada into 2, and an offensive through Detroit and Albany, taking the industrial heart of Canada. Given the amount of troops America had versus the amount in Canada had, these attacks from the west would be an American victory. However, on the eastern front, Canadians and Americans would batter each other into exhaustion. Attacks would be stalled because of the equal numbers. To make matters worse for the Americans, British would rally forces from Europe, Australia, India, and other colonies to prepare an invasion of the U.S. The British would also deploy its navy to begin a naval blockade and bring the American economy to its knees, with the remaining naval forces in Britain would try to regain the initiative and track the main American fleet. By this time, we are possibly weeks into the war. Britain, with its air force, would begin major bombing campaigns in America coastal cities, such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and etc. America would soon be able to repel these attacks and be able to better defend itself in coastal cities. The war in the West would be lost by the Canadians, with them retreating to the newly arrived British forces in Halifax. The provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario would surrender to the American might, leaving Quebec and the remainder of the eastern provinces still fighting. All forces from the west would begin moving east to support the American First Army, engaging the Canadians in Quebec City and Montreal. The front along eastern Canada would come to a stalemate, and peace talks would begin. Due to the extensiveness of the peace talks, the American troops would be able to end the siege of Quebec City and Montreal, cutting off the Canadians and the British from Quebec. While war did not happen, it was possible, but only stopped because the British and the Americans had a common enemy, Germany, which allowed the British and Americans to build their relations and allowed them to become allies after World War II.